I sold my company for $30 million. But that night, I stood alone in a damp rental apartment, listening to my son tell me he wasn't in a position to help right now. I wasn't asking for money. I was only asking for a place to sit down. On the other end of the line, there was silence. Then his wife's voice cut in, cool and precise. Just drive around for a bit. In that moment, I understood a bitter truth. When a father has nothing left to give, that's when the truth finally shows itself. Before I go on with this story, if you're still listening, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting me know where you're hearing this on a quiet evening, on your way home, or at a moment when you needed to slow down and breathe. Now, let me tell you how all of this began. After that call, the room fell back into silence. I stood there for a long time, my hand still holding the phone, the screen already dark. Not because I expected them to call back. At 68, I've learned to tell the difference between hesitation and a door that is just quietly closed. The apartment I was staying in was never part of any retirement plan. It was small, thin walls. The smell of dampness clung to every corner. I chose it on purpose. If I wanted to, I could have been sitting in a wide living room facing the Pacific Ocean watching sunsets that make people believe life has turned out just fine. But I wasn't there to enjoy anything. I was there to see clearly. 3 weeks earlier, I was still in Seattle. The conference room that day was bright, almost cold. The contract lay on the table, thick and neat, like everything I had built over 40 years. When I signed the final page, the lawyer smiled and congratulated me. $30 million. A number many people would call a perfect success. I smiled too. But my thoughts weren't on the money. I thought about Brooks. I thought about the upcoming Thanksgiving dinner, about placing a new car key on the table and telling my son he didn't have to worry about his future anymore. I believed after everything that would bring him some relief. Everything changed that evening. I went back to the office to pick up an old watch. Most of the hallway lights were already off. As I passed the small meeting room, I heard a familiar voice. Melanie, my daughter-in-law. Her voice was low but clear enough. She wasn't talking to Brooks. She was talking to another man. I didn't stop for long. I heard just enough to understand. Words like family fund the old man and dividing it up floated through a conversation with no caution at all. There was nothing vague about her tone. It was the voice of someone who had planned this ahead of time. I left the building without looking back. That Seattle night felt colder than usual. I wasn't angry. I wasn't surprised. I felt one thing very clearly. If I spoke the truth right then, I wouldn't know who I was standing in front of. So I chose silence. The next morning I called my lawyer. I didn't talk about the $30 million. I talked about protection, about trusts, about making sure everything was arranged so no one could touch it, even if they believed I had nothing left. He asked if I was certain. I told him at my age, I'm only certain of one thing: the truth shows itself, only when there's no benefit left to hide it. The bankruptcy story began with small details. I sold the car I usually drove. I moved out of the coastal house, telling the neighbors I needed to scale down. I traded tailored suits for an old jacket. I let my beard grow longer. No one questioned it. People find it easy to believe an old man can stumble after stepping down from the peak. A few days later, I called Brooks. I didn't dramatize anything. I said the company had run into trouble, that I'd sold everything to cover debts, and that I needed a temporary place to stay. On the other end, my son was silent for a long moment. I heard him exhale, as if calculating something in his head. Then Melanie spoke, not to ask how I was. She asked how long I planned to stay. That question said more than any refusal ever could. I arrived in Carmel late that afternoon. I didn't drive straight to my son's house. I stopped at the rental apartment first. I needed to be sure I had somewhere to return to, no matter how things turned out. Only after night fully settled did I call Brooks again. I stood by the window, looking out at an empty parking lot, and said the words no father ever wants to say, that I had nothing left. I wasn't looking for pity. I just wanted to know when everything was stripped away, what was I worth in my son's eyes? Their car passed by the apartment. I recognized it immediately. The headlights swept across the window, then disappeared. The phone in my hand never vibrated again. I sat down on the old chair beside the table. In that moment, I knew I had crossed a line. Not a line of money, but a line of truth. And I understood that from here on, what I would see wouldn't be comfortable. But it was necessary. Sometimes, to know whether a house truly belongs to you, you have to stand outside the door and wait to see who holds the key. The next morning, I didn't call ahead. I carried my old suitcase, the same one that traveled with me on long business trips back when Brooks was still in elementary school. I wanted to see their reaction up close. No time to prepare, no excuses, sharpened in advance. Brooks's house sat on a quiet road overlooking the ocean. Everything there was bright, orderly, carefully maintained. I stood at the door for a few seconds, took a slow breath, then rang the bell. Melanie answered. She looked me up and down, her eyes stopping at the worn edges of my suitcase. That look wasn't surprise. It was the look of someone who had expected a nuisance and was deciding how to deal with it efficiently. "You're early, Dad," she said, her voice even. Brooks stood behind her, avoiding my eyes. I stepped inside. No one hugged me. No one asked if I'd eaten. I didn't blame them. I simply took note. Melanie said there were no spare rooms. She said it quickly, like an obvious fact that needed no explanation. Then she pointed toward the garage, where an old folding bed sat beside a few unopened boxes. "You can stay there for now." "Just a few days," she said. I nodded. I hadn't come to argue. Brooks looked at me, his lips moving as if he wanted to say something. Then he stopped. The garage door closed behind me, soft but final. The space was cold with the smell of metal in the air. I set my suitcase down and sat on the folding bed. From there, I could hear the television inside. A brief laugh, then silence. I realized I was very close and very far away. That evening, Brooks brought me a thin envelope. Inside were a few bills. He said I should keep it and maybe look into assistance programs for seniors. He said it gently, as if offering practical advice. I took the envelope, thanked my son, then set it back on the table. I didn't say anything else. The words that wanted to come out would only have made things clearer in ways no one was ready to face. When night fell, I lay on the folding bed, staring at the low ceiling. I could hear them talking in the living room. Not every word, but enough to know I wasn't a topic meant to be whispered about. I turned on the small recording device I had placed there earlier. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed to know where I stood. Melanie's voice grew clearer as she moved closer to the garage door. She talked about money, about how Brooks had already spent too much on me, given the current situation. She gave a light laugh when she said, "I knew how to play the victim." Then another man's voice came through the phone. Not Brooks. She spoke casually, like she was giving a progress update. That everything was under control, that with a little more time it would all be wrapped up neatly. I didn't need to hear more to understand what she meant. I turned off the device and put it back. In that moment I felt a familiar emptiness. Not pain, just confirmation. Near midnight I stood up and stepped out of the garage. I moved slowly on purpose, one hand against the wall, breathing heavier than usual. I let the door make a small sound as it opened. I wanted to see how they would react if they thought I was truly getting weaker. I sat down in a chair in the living room, one hand pressed to my chest, my head lowered. No one came out right away. I heard Melanie's voice upstairs, irritated. She told Brooks I was just trying to get attention, that if he kept indulging me, things would spiral. Brooks stayed silent. Then his footsteps stopped at the stairs. He didn't come down. The lights didn't turn on. I sat there a few more minutes, then stood up on my own and went back to the garage. No one followed. No one asked if I was okay. When the door closed, I sat back on the folding bed, my back against the cold wall. I had no doubts left. What I was seeing wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice, repeated quietly over and over again. The next morning, Melanie acted as if nothing had happened. She asked if I'd slept well, then reminded me they were busy all day. Brooks avoided my eyes as he left the house. I stayed alone in the garage. I opened my suitcase and rearranged a few old belongings. Among them was a faded family photo. I placed it on the small table beside the bed. I looked at Brooks's face as a child standing next to his mother and wondered when things had started to turn this way. I didn't cry. I wasn't angry. I just felt as though I was finally looking at a more complete picture, even if it wasn't a beautiful one. And I knew that if I wanted to find out whether there was any path back at all, I would have to wait and see who walked into the garage before this door closed for good. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of the cold in the garage, but because of a familiar feeling. The feeling of someone who once stood very high, now sitting very low, seeing everything from a different angle. I heard Brooks's car come back later than usual. The front door opened, then closed more gently than it had during the day. There was no television inside. No short bursts of laughter. Just a long stretch of silence. After a while, the garage door opened. Brooks stood there without turning on the light. The dim glow from the hallway was enough for me to see his face. He looked tired, not work tired, but the kind of tired that shows up when someone starts doubting their own choices. "Are you still awake, Dad?" he asked softly. I didn't answer right away. I sat on the folding bed, my hands resting on my knees as if I'd just been woken up. I let the silence do its work. Brooks stepped inside and pulled the old chair closer. He sat down, his head lowered. After a long moment, he said he wasn't used to seeing me here, that everything felt not quite right. I nodded. I told him that at this age, many things stop being what we thought they were. I let myself drift into a hazy state, bringing up small memories as if my thoughts were slipping. I talked about his mother, about the wedding ring I once sold so I could cover Brooks's final semester of tuition. I didn't say it with bitterness. I said it the way a man reads through an old checklist, things a father finished a long time ago. Brooks stopped looking at me. I saw his shoulders tighten. When I fell quiet, the air between us felt heavier than before. "You never told me that," he said. I smiled faintly. I told him some things lose their meaning once they're spoken. They're meant to exist as choices, not as debts. Brooks stood up and said he'd be right back. When the garage door closed, I opened my suitcase. I knew he would return, and I also knew that if he did, he would see what I had deliberately left in sight. There were no bills inside, no debt papers, just a few old clothes and a stack of newspapers neatly cut. Each clipping carried a familiar name. Brooks's name. Small articles about projects he'd worked on. Moments when he'd been mentioned at conferences. I didn't keep them out of pride. I kept them because it was the only way I knew how to follow my son's life from a distance. Brooks came back quickly, holding a bottle of water. As he set it down, his eyes stopped on the newspapers. He didn't ask right away. He picked them up one by one, reading slowly, like a diary that had never been written for him. "Dad, why do you keep these?" he asked. I told him that when people grow old, they don't have much left to hold on to. They keep the things that remind them their time mattered. Brooks sat down on the folding bed, no longer keeping his distance. He said he had overheard Melanie on the phone, that he hadn't caught everything, but enough to know something wasn't right. He said that for the first time he felt like he was living in a house that didn't belong to him. I didn't interrupt. I let my son speak. I had been waiting for this moment longer than I realized. After a while, Brooks stood up and went back into the house. I heard a drawer open, then close. When he returned to the garage, he was holding a thicker envelope than the night before. "This is my money," he said. "I saved it. It's not much, but it's mine." I looked at the envelope, then at my son. I asked if he was sure. He nodded firm this time. He said if he had to choose between a false sense of peace and doing what was right, he would choose the second, even if it meant starting over. He said he'd been thinking about leaving, not out of anger, but because he no longer recognized himself. He said that if I agreed, he would go with me, not to run away, but to stand somewhere both of us could finally see clearly. I took the envelope but didn't open it. I placed it back in his hand. I told him I didn't need his money. What I needed had just shown up. A choice. Brooks looked at me for a long time. In his eyes, I saw the boy who once stood outside the school gate waiting for me to arrive later than usual. No resentment, just waiting. I took a slow breath. I told him there were truths I still hadn't shared. Not to test him, but to protect him. I said that if he wanted to hear them, we would talk the next morning when everything was quiet enough not to be interrupted. Brooks nodded. He stood up and turned off the garage light before leaving. For the first time since I arrived, the door closed without carrying the feeling of being abandoned. I lay back on the folding bed, staring at the dark ceiling. I knew something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to break a pattern that had gone on for far too long. And I also knew when the light turned on tomorrow, there would be people who could no longer keep standing. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The garage was still cold, but it no longer carried the feeling of being forgotten like it had the days before. Brooks came out not long after me. He didn't say much. He just asked if I wanted coffee. That small question was enough to tell me his decision from the night before wasn't impulsive. We drove out and stopped at a small cafe near the harbor. That's where I told my son the rest of the story. No rambling, no decoration. I talked about the contract to sell the company, about the money being placed into protective structures known only to me and my lawyer. I told him I hadn't done it to teach anyone a lesson, but to protect myself from trusting the wrong people one more time. Brooks didn't interrupt. He just sat there, his hand wrapped around a cup of coffee, slowly going cold. When I finished, he let out a long breath as if he finally understood why everything had felt so heavy. "So, what do you want to do now, Dad?" he asked. I told him I wanted things to end quietly, but clearly. No noise, no arguments, just the truth placed where it belonged. Brooks nodded. He said if I needed him beside me, he'd be there. Not as an heir, but as a son. That evening I sent a message to Melanie. I said I wanted to invite both of them to my rental apartment for dinner. I added that I was still holding on to an important piece of information, something I had never told Brooks. An old account, a reserve. I didn't mention any amount. I only said I was considering entrusting it to the person I trusted most. The reply came quickly. Melanie answered with a short message, more polite than usual. She said she would come. I prepared a simple dinner. No expensive wine, no dramatic lighting, just enough for people to sit down and talk. Brooks arrived early. He stood beside me asking no questions. I knew he was uneasy, but I also knew he was ready to face whatever came next. Melanie arrived late. She walked into the apartment with her familiar smile, her eyes quickly scanning the room. She asked if I was feeling better, then sat down, keeping just enough distance to appear courteous. I started with harmless conversation. The weather, the small apartment. I said living there helped me think more clearly. Melanie nodded, appearing attentive. When I mentioned the old account, her eyes changed quickly, but not quickly enough to hide it completely. I said it was money I had kept overseas in case everything ever collapsed. I said I was considering transferring control, that at my age I needed someone practical, decisive. I looked directly at Melanie as I said those words. She didn't refuse. She didn't rush forward either. She simply said that if I trusted her, she was willing to help. Brooks stayed silent. I could feel the tension in the way his hand tightened. I stood up and said I needed to get some documents from the bedroom. As I turned away, I knew exactly what would happen. I didn't need to listen in. I only needed to give them enough space to reveal themselves. I stepped into the bedroom and closed the door. Not long after, I heard Melanie's voice drop lower. Then, the sound of a phone call. She spoke faster now, no longer holding on to polite restraint. She talked about acting quickly, about not missing the opportunity. She spoke the way people do when they believe they've already won. I opened the bedroom door. The living room lights came on brighter. Brooks stood up. The front door opened. My lawyer walked in, accompanied by another legal representative. No one raised their voice. No one pointed fingers. Melanie froze for a few seconds, then smiled a stiff, misplaced smile. I spoke very slowly. I said there was no account to transfer, that everything she had just said had been fully recorded, that what she believed was an opportunity was in truth evidence. Melanie looked at Brooks. She said I had manipulated my son, that I had staged a cruel performance. I didn't argue. I only said that without truth, no performance could last that long. The lawyer placed a thick folder on the table. No one opened it. There was no need. The silence in that moment was heavy enough to make explanations unnecessary. Melanie stood up, her chair scraping softly. She didn't apologize. She only asked if I was satisfied. I told her I wasn't looking for satisfaction. I was looking for an ending. She left without looking back. The door closed, not loudly, but decisively. Brooks sat down. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he asked why it had to go that far. I told him some truths only appear when people believe no one is watching. That night, when the apartment grew quiet again, I looked at my son and knew something had ended. Not a marriage, but an illusion that had lasted far too long. After Melanie left, the small apartment returned to its familiar quiet. Neither of us spoke right away. Brooks sat there, both hands resting on his knees, his back slightly hunched, as if he had just carried something far heavier than he was meant to. I didn't rush to break the silence. Some moments, silence is the kindest thing we can offer each other. The next morning, Brooks packed a few personal belongings. There were no arguments, no pleading. Melanie didn't come back, and I knew that even if she had, everything had already closed the night before. Not because of legal papers, but because trust no longer had a place to stand. I drove Brooks away from the coastal house around noon. My old truck was already parked outside. He stared at it for a moment, then let out a quiet laugh, a sound mixed with embarrassment and relief. I told him I wasn't trying to punish him this way. I just wanted both of us to step away from the things that had made us forget who we were. We started traveling slowly, through small towns, stopping in places with nothing remarkable about them. Brooks helped me unload supplies, fix an old porch, do work he used to pay others to handle. I didn't lecture. I didn't bring up the past. I simply watched. Each evening we ate simple meals. Brooks talked more, not about some distant future, but about very small things. He said that for the first time in many years he didn't feel like he had to prove himself to anyone. I listened and nodded. At my age, that was a complete answer. A few weeks later, when we returned to Carmel, I called my lawyer. Not about Melanie. That chapter was closed. I talked about a scholarship fund. I wanted to use part of the money to create something not bearing my name, like a monument, but like a door. I called it Second Chance. Brooks joined from the very beginning. He didn't lead with authority. He worked like someone who had once stood in the wrong place and was now carefully setting each brick back where it belonged. I didn't stand behind him giving orders. I stood beside him when needed, and stepped back when I wasn't. When the fund officially began, there was no grand ceremony, just a small gathering with young people trying to find their way again. Brooks shared his story, not to earn sympathy, but to say that anyone can lose their way, and anyone can return if they choose the right moment. That afternoon, I sat alone looking out at the ocean, not from my old house, but from a simple wooden bench. I thought about the $30 million. That number once represented my entire working life. Now, it was just a tool, nothing more. Brooks came and sat beside me. He asked if I had any regrets. I asked him what he meant. He talked about the small apartment, the cold garage, everything I had endured just to see the truth. I answered slowly. I told him that if I hadn't done it, I might have lost my son in a far quieter way, and that sometimes, to keep what matters most, we have to accept losing things that only seem important. Before we left, Brooks said he wanted to buy back the coastal house, not to live there alone, but to make it a place family could return to if they still wanted to call each other family. I didn't answer right away. I simply placed my hand on my son's shoulder. Some promises don't need to be spoken. Now, as I tell this story, I don't see myself as a winner. I don't see anyone as a loser either. I see a father who was lucky enough to look back in time, and a son who was brave enough to turn around. $30 million are just lifeless numbers. They come and they go. The real legacy I leave behind isn't in any account. It lives in the fact that my son knows when to stop, knows right from wrong, and knows that a person's value isn't measured by what they own, but by the choices they make when there's nothing left to hide behind. Sometimes you have to pretend to hit rock bottom, just to see who is willing to sit beside you, even when your pockets are empty. If you stayed until these final words, thank you for listening to my story. If it made you pause and think, please press, like as a quiet acknowledgement. If you know someone facing difficult choices within their family, share this story so they know they're not alone. And if you want to keep walking alongside stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what comes next. Life isn't measured by how much money we make, but by the decisions we make when we have nothing left to lean on. Families aren't perfect, neither are people. But when truth is faced with silence and respect, there is always a chance to begin again. Thank you for listening, and I wish you the calm it takes to hold on to what matters most.